The flow state is addictive as it's one of the peak experiences that we can control with effort. Flow, however, is very expensive neurochemically to induce these peak experiences, which can lead to the dark side of flow. Let me explain more on why we need to understand what the dark side of flow is and the flow hangover so that we can experience more flow and more peak experiences without burnout. Many driven people become flow junkies, chasing that high just like any other drug. Sometimes this just leads to burnout, but other times this can become dangerous and even catastrophic in its ending. It's why understanding the flow cycle and the need for recovery is crucial to the complete picture of the operating system that you experience flow with. Most commonly, people will either continue to chase the exact same flow state without any growth or progress to avoid that slide into the complete dark side of flow, or they will skip out on recovery altogether, which never ends well. When I was competing in strongman, I would experience what I called a flow hangover that would last a day or two after competitions because you'd get into such a peak state of intensity in competition that you'd completely be left depleted of all energy and all neurochemicals after this state. Every ounce of you is depleted, and this is even before the soreness would kick in. Now, I've got 3 strategies that we can use to conquer the dark side of flow and come back from it. I'm going to share those as well as how to determine when to assess your peak performance routine to understand when you need to back off or make changes to it. This will help you to come to terms with the dark side so that it doesn't overwhelm you and you can get the most out of your flow states. First, we've got to respect the dark side of flow. Understand that there's a seasonality to everything in our lives, and flow states are no different. We have to respect the need to let one flow state come to an end, and the complete cycle of flow always includes that recovery phase before we can start into another full experience of the deepest levels of flow states. When we let ourselves recharge before starting back into our peak states again, we end up fighting ourselves less. We're able to reach those peaks without that state of burnout or constantly being depleted and pushing towards that edge. And coming to terms with the dark side is a common theme in all of human nature. All good heroes' journeys face a dragon. There's that force of evil that we battle that the hero tries to fight to maintain the goodness. Now, being aware that flow states present the same challenge will help you to be prepared when it does show up. Sometimes if our primary flow activities are lower in intensity levels and more drawn out, it takes a while for this dark side of flow to show up because we can go much longer and sustain our flow states for much longer if they don't have those peaks of intensity. Whereas something like the high adrenaline, high level of challenge of a strongman competition or other really intense event will quickly have that need for recovery afterwards with that sharp increase in that flow hangover. But regardless, when you're pushing yourself and experiencing flow states more often, know that the need for recovery will come eventually. And this leads to the second point, which is more flow equals more recovery. In the highest of highs, we will need to allow for more recovery time. It's inevitable that the harder you push yourself, your mind, or your body, the more recovery that you're going to need. We can't maintain performing at such a peak indefinitely. And I've found when competing in something like strongman or powerlifting, there's a phase early in that sports career where you want to be competing as frequently as possible. Usually there's a shorter season for a sport like strongman that's mostly played or competed outside. We tend to compete in the summer seasons, And so there are a lot of competitions packed into a short time frame. So when you're starting out, it's often recommended that you get to every single competition to gain that experience that you can. Now, this is doable when early in the career or when you're just starting out, because you can't reach the same peak state as when you've pushed for more and more years. You become able to flip that switch and to get into a much higher level of performance and peak state. And this is when that flow hangover starts to come in much quicker and much sooner, immediately after every competition. When this happens and you're experiencing more flow, it's also going to require that you shut off, recover, recharge more intently after those performances. That's why I think that strength in sports makes such a good analogy for understanding these fluctuations in peak states and performance levels, because we can physically feel what's going on and that need for recovery. Whereas in more mentally challenging aspects of flow states and high performance, sometimes we can prolong for much longer before we really hit that decline into burnout. And developing that awareness or transferring it over from something like sports or physical performances is a helpful way to gain that insight into what your body needs recovery-wise. So we can recognize and plan for these all-out efforts and highest of high peak states through a practice called hedonic calendaring. In addition to planning to recover more, when you've hit a peak state of flow in your primary flow activity, hedonic calendaring reminds us to space out those peak experiences in our lives throughout the year. In the book Stealing Fire, Jamie Wheel and Stephen Kotler introduced this hedonic calendaring concept as a way to respect the gifts of insight that we gain from flow states and other peak experiences without that dark side swallowing us up completely. It's a method of planning out and strategically placing your peak experiences throughout the year so that you don't face burnout or risk being unable to perform at all. This doesn't mean that we can't experience flow every single day. It just means recognizing when you're reaching those really high peak states of flow and how to space those out while maintaining those secondary flow activities or other flow inducing tasks in your life on a daily basis with that spacing of those more peak experiences. It's about being aware that there are different levels of flow that we can experience and the drain that comes from them depending on how intense they are. So if you're chasing flow states in more high intensity activities or sports, think about how you can space those peak flow states out throughout your schedule or throughout the year, while also incorporating those other peak experiences you may be involved in, like going to concerts or Burning Man type events where people are exploring those higher consciousness states together. The process for doing this includes listing out all of the different peak states that you experience and ranking them by how intense the state is for you, as well as how much of that flow hangover it produces in you, if you know what that is. This helps to categorize it by the risk inherent in those flow states, as well as the cost neurochemically or those neurotransmitter expenses that come from how intense the state is. And then we can assign a value to each of these peak states and then space them out strategically based on that. In a knowledge work setting, Cal Newport takes a semester off from his teaching roles each summer to spend more time doing deep work on making huge progress on the books that he writes. This is a way that we can apply these hedonic calendaring concepts to the seasonality of the years and when we want to be much more intense and deliberate on completing one specific project. And so this is a way that we can also tie this in to knowledge work or doing things that are more creative rather than just the high performance sports environment. So some examples of hedonic calendaring in practice would look like daily, you can be doing things like meditation, yoga, exercise, and creative work. Weekly, you might include a challenging workout or an extended deep work session on your creative work of 4 or 5 hours at a time so that you can get much more into that deeper state of flow with it. Monthly may look like doing a competition if it is a sports performance like strongman or powerlifting. Usually a monthly frequency is enough time to recover from something like that. Or maybe on the creative side of it, it's a concert or a performance that you're doing. And then seasonally, it may look like a championship competition that you do once a season or something more intense. And then annually, you piece this all together. Maybe it's with an extended travel vacation where there's lots of rich and flow-inducing activities, or there's more intense experiences of peak states like going to those higher consciousness events like Burning Man. These are things that usually are so depleting that once or twice a year is the upper limit of what most of us can handle without getting in the way of our other performance states. So to reiterate, all flow states are not created equal, and hedonic calendaring is a way to have better balance with the flow-inducing activities in our lives and how to approach these strategically to not have to constantly seek those higher risk flow states or risk burnout and that flow hangover. Now, the final thing I want to go into is how do you know when to do all of this hedonic calendaring stuff? We can use our intuition and just kind of go off of what we've experienced in the past to build out a hedonic calendar and a plan for ourselves. But there are a couple other tools and strategies that can help you to gain greater awareness and insight to strategize around this right now. The first one is to see what patterns in your recovery start to emerge for you. And I like to do this by tracking HRV and other recovery signals in your life. We can do this qualitatively or quantitatively using things like a simple pen and paper to track out our stress score, how we're feeling with energy, and looking at those trends over time to kind of get a sense on what our recovery feels like. Or you can use things like an Apple Watch or Whoop or Oura Ring to build out a sense of your HRV and some of these other performance metrics that indicate when we're in a prolonged stressed state versus when we're recovering well. The signs of being in a lower HRV state or a stressed out state for longer than we can sustain is when we're reaching that point of burnout that it's important to recover from. As you get the sense of the patterns that emerge over time with tracking your recovery, you're going to be able to better inform that hedonic calendar for yourself. This is something that builds out on the scale of years and usually not something that we can just intuitively grasp our first time around trying to strategize our peak states and get to higher levels of performance. And you can also monitor your flow states and how deep of a flow experience you're getting using the Flow Hacker Handbook. I put together this dashboard and tool in Notion as a way to track flow states and the different conditions of flow that you're experiencing so that you can identify those peak states, those peak flow activities for yourself, and look at the trends over time. If the same things that are your primary flow activities are starting to provide diminishing returns on how deep or how rich that flow experience is, it's a signal that maybe you're reaching more of a burnout flow hangover state where you need to start to include more recovery time, or because you're able to push the boundaries of that flow state much more, it also is where more recovery comes into play. So see those trends in your flow experiences with the flow tracker. And When I see that I'm starting to diminish in my ability to experience flow every day or in my primary activities that bring me the most flow, I start to plan out recoup time so that I can get back on track. Because to me, the sustained long-term performance is much more than important than just trying to have those peak states come in every once in a while. So to summarize and recap some of what we've talked about, respect the dark side of flow and that the need for recovery is an important part of your flow operating system. When you're experiencing more flow, recognize that it's also a time to introduce more recovery in order to sustain performance, and use some of the strategies with hedonic calendaring in order to create a complete peak performance picture for yourself for the whole year. Now, you don't have to have all the answers right now. Build some awareness into this practice by looking at the last quarter-ish that we have of the year and try to strategize in hedonic calendar just that section of the year for yourself. Then when we get to the end of 2024, you can look at how you did and reflect back on whether you estimated correctly, what was good for your performance or what was detrimental, and where you can kind of improve from there. And you can take action on this right now. Hedonic calendaring takes time to really hone and become an effective practice for you. But look at this final quarter of the year that we kind of have left, or the last couple of months, and figure out what you can do in this next quarter. You'll get some insight, you'll get some feedback into how you've tried to implement your hedonic calendaring strategy. And then you can build from there and look at the full next calendar as a way to move forward with some greater insight. And I know that I touched on it when talking about different ways to understand your own flow states as a way to build that hedonic calendar. But if you want to go deeper into tracking flow states and how to identify your peak experiences, check out this video next, where I talk about how I built the ultimate tool for tracking flow states.